There is a traitor inside the operation. Joe knows it. The CIA knows it. But the most dangerous part isn't knowing that someone has betrayed them. It's knowing that the traitor may have been standing beside them the entire time. And tonight, we're not going to start this story with a gunfight. We're going to start with a question. Who does Joe trust? Because in the world of Lioness, that question can get you killed. Joe McNamara has spent years learning one simple rule: never assume the person beside you is who they claim to be. But this time, something is different. The enemy isn't simply attacking from the outside. They're getting information from the inside. They know where Joe's people are. They know what the CIA is looking for. They know when operations are moving. They know which people matter. And that means someone is talking. Someone is leaking. Someone is watching. And if Joe is right, the infiltrator isn't just helping the enemy. They're predicting Joe's next move. That is what makes Season 3 Episode 4 so dangerous. Because Joe isn't simply hunting an enemy anymore. She's hunting a ghost. And the closer she gets, the fewer people she can trust. Today, we're going to reconstruct the entire mystery. We're going to look at the clues. We're going to examine the suspicious behavior. We're going to connect the Ukrainian double agent angle to the larger network. And most importantly, we're going to reveal the person who, in our theory, Joe may eventually realize is sitting at the center of this operation. But here's the warning. The person we're going to discuss is not necessarily the obvious suspect. And that's exactly why this theory works. Let's start with the one fact that changes everything. There has been a breach. And according to the episode setup, Joe is dealing with an infiltration problem rather than a conventional attack. That distinction is massive. Because if an enemy attacks you from outside, you can build a wall. You can increase security. You can bring in more soldiers. But what happens when the enemy is already inside? Then every security measure becomes meaningless. Every conversation becomes dangerous. Every phone call becomes suspicious. Every mission briefing becomes a potential leak. And every member of the team becomes a possible suspect. That is the nightmare Joe is facing, and Joe understands this better than almost anyone. She has spent her career operating in environments where information can mean the difference between life and death. So when something doesn't add up, Joe doesn't ignore it. She starts pulling the thread. And once Joe pulls that thread, she doesn't stop. Here's what I think Joe initially gets wrong. She assumes the infiltrator is stealing information. But what if that's not the real objective? What if the infiltrator isn't trying to learn what Joe knows? What if the infiltrator is trying to influence what Joe believes? That is a completely different operation. Imagine someone inside the CIA gives Joe one piece of information. It's accurate. Joe trusts it. Then they give her another piece. Also accurate. Joe trusts that one too. Then comes the third piece. Still mostly true. But this time, there's one tiny lie hidden inside it. Joe follows it. And suddenly she's exactly where the enemy wanted her. That is not traditional espionage. That's manipulation. And if someone is doing this to Joe, they understand her. They understand how she thinks. They understand her priorities. And they know that Joe will chase a threat once she believes innocent lives are at stake. That makes the infiltrator much more dangerous than an ordinary mole. Now let's bring in one of the most important clues from the early part of Season 3. Joe begins suspecting that the captured operation may not be as straightforward as it appears. The investigation starts pointing toward a Ukrainian double agent. That development is crucial because it gives Joe a tangible suspect. And Joe does what Joe always does. She moves. The team goes after the suspected operative. The target is taken, and now the CIA has someone they can question. But here's the problem. What if the Ukrainian operative isn't the infiltrator? What if that person is simply the first layer? This is where the conspiracy becomes much more interesting. Because intelligence operations rarely depend on one person. A double agent might provide information. Another person might verify it. Someone else might pass it along. Another person might disguise its origin. And somewhere at the top, someone decides what information is actually worth transmitting. So even if Joe identifies a Ukrainian operative, she may have only found the messenger, not the architect. And that distinction could become one of the biggest revelations of Episode 4. Think about how a professional intelligence operation would work. If you wanted to protect the real mole, what would you do? You'd give investigators another suspect. Someone believable. Someone with a legitimate connection to the enemy. Someone whose communications could be traced. Someone who could explain just enough of the evidence to make the investigation feel complete. That's the perfect decoy. And Joe may be walking directly toward one. The Ukrainian double agent theory is attractive because it explains several things. It explains the leak. It explains foreign involvement. It gives Joe someone to interrogate. But it doesn't necessarily explain everything. It doesn't explain why the attack seems so precisely timed. It doesn't explain how certain people keep disappearing from the board. And it doesn't explain how the enemy appears to anticipate the CIA. That requires something more. It requires access. Not just to information. And that distinction could become one of the biggest revelations of Episode 4. Think about how a professional intelligence operation would work. If you wanted to protect the real mole, what would you do? You'd give investigators another suspect. Someone believable. Someone with a legitimate connection to the enemy. Someone whose communications could be traced. Someone who could explain just enough of the evidence to make the investigation feel complete. That's the perfect decoy. And Joe may be walking directly toward one. The Ukrainian double agent theory is attractive because it explains several things. It explains the leak. It explains foreign involvement. It gives Joe someone to interrogate. But it doesn't necessarily explain everything. It doesn't explain why the attack seems so precisely timed. It doesn't explain how certain people keep disappearing from the board. And it doesn't explain how the enemy appears to anticipate the CIA. That requires something more. It requires access. Not just to information. But to decision-making. And that's why I believe Joe's real investigation has to go higher. This is where things become personal. The enemy knows Joe. Not personally. Professionally. They know her habits. They know what kind of threats will get her attention. They know what kind of evidence she will trust. They know she won't abandon a mission because things become dangerous. And they know something else. Joe will always choose the mission. Even when the mission costs her something personally. That's been one of the defining characteristics of Joe McNamara. She can be exhausted. She can be terrified. She can be emotionally destroyed. But if the mission needs to happen, Joe goes. And an enemy who understands that can manipulate her. They don't need to threaten Joe directly, they only need to threaten something she cares about. The team. Her family. An innocent asset. A national security threat. Anything. Give Joe a reason to move, and she'll move. And this brings us to Neil. Because while Joe is fighting an invisible war outside the house, her husband is becoming increasingly aware that something is wrong. The official Episode 4 synopsis specifically notes that Neil is struggling with growing fears at home. That detail is not random. At least, I don't think it is. Because Lioness has always been interested in the cost of intelligence work, Joe's professional life doesn't stay at work. It follows her home. It affects her marriage. It affects her children. And if the enemy realizes that, Joe's family becomes another attack surface. Now imagine the infiltrator understands Joe well enough to know that her family is the one place where she can't completely shut down emotionally. That changes the game. Joe may be able to walk into a war zone without hesitation. But threaten her family, and 5 suddenly she's vulnerable. So what would the perfect infiltrator look like? Not someone suspicious. Not someone constantly disappearing. Not someone who obviously hates America. The perfect infiltrator would be someone who looks completely loyal. Someone who has been useful. Someone whose presence makes the operation stronger. Someone nobody wants to suspect. Because if everyone suspects the same person, the mole has already failed. The real infiltrator must be invisible. And that's why my theory doesn't focus on the person shouting the loudest. It focuses on the person who has access to information before everyone else does. Ask yourself, who knows about an operation before it begins? Who knows where the team is going? Who knows which target matters? Who knows what Joe is planning? Who can communicate without attracting suspicion? And who would be trusted enough that nobody questions their movements? That's the profile Joe needs to investigate. This is where I imagine one of the most important scenes of episode 4. Joe stops looking at people. She starts looking at timelines. She writes down every major incident. The first attack. The intelligence leak. The compromised operation. The disappearance. The enemy's movement. The team's response. Then she puts the times next to each event. And suddenly, there is a pattern. Every time the enemy move, someone on the inside has already moved. Every time Joe changes direction, the enemy reacts. Every time the CIA makes a decision, the opposition somehow knows. That can't be coincidence. Joe stares at the timeline. And then she realizes something. The enemy isn't reacting to the CIA. The enemy is receiving information before the CIA acts. That's the moment everything changes. Because now Joe knows where to look. Joe's next question becomes simple. Who had access? Not who had motive. Not who hates the United States. Not who has connections to Russia or Ukraine. Who had access? That's how Joe catches people. She doesn't always ask who would do something. She asks who could do it. And once she creates that list, it becomes very small. That's when the paranoia begins. Because suddenly, people Joe has worked with for years start appearing on the list. People she trusts. People who have saved lives. People who have been in firefights with her. And that's the cruelest part of espionage. A traitor doesn't always look like a traitor. Sometimes they look like a friend. There's another clue hiding in plain sight. The infiltrator has survived. Think about that. The CIA has already been hunting the source of the leak. Yet the leak continues. That means the infiltrator is either extremely good, or the investigation keeps looking in the wrong direction. I believe it's both. The mole is good. But the larger advantage is misdirection. Every time Joe gets close, something else happens. A new threat. A new target. A new crisis. A new emergency. And Joe has to respond. That's how you keep someone from solving a mystery. You don't hide the truth. You overwhelm them with other problems. And Joe has plenty of problems. Now let's talk about the title of episode 4. Murder Hornets. That title is interesting because murder hornets aren't dangerous because one insect is unbeatable. They're dangerous because of the collective threat. That's an interesting metaphor for what Joe may be facing. She isn't hunting one enemy. She's dealing with a network. One person might be the infiltrator. But several people may be benefiting from the infiltration. One person leaks. Another person transports. Another person hides. Another person kills. And someone coordinates the entire operation. That's why Joe can't simply capture one person and assume the problem is over. She has to find the network. And that could explain why the episode description talks about a frantic hunt rather than a simple interrogation. The team is racing against time. Because the longer the infiltrator remains active, the more dangerous the operation becomes. Imagine Joe discovering that another operation has already been compromised. The team has a target. They prepare. They move. And then, nothing. The target is gone. The safe house is empty. The phones are dead. The enemy knew. Again. That's when Joe stops being angry. She becomes quiet. And everyone on the team notices. Because they know what quiet Joe means. It means she's thinking. She isn't asking. How did they escape? She's asking, who knew we were coming? That's the question that can destroy the entire operation. And this is where Joe could make a brilliant move. She creates a fake mission. Only a handful of people receive the details. But each person receives a slightly different version. One person gets location A. Another gets location B. Another gets location C. Then Joe waits. She doesn't tell the team why. She doesn't explain. She simply waits. And if the enemy reacts to one of those locations, Joe knows exactly which information leaked. That's how you catch an infiltrator. You don't ask them whether they're guilty. You give them a chance to betray themselves. And Joe has spent too much time in this business not to understand that. Now imagine that one of those fake locations gets attacked. Joe watches the information come in. A hostile movement. A communication. A suspicious change. And suddenly she knows. Someone leaked the location. The infiltrator has taken the bait. But here's the twist. The person who leaked the information isn't necessarily the person Joe expected. Because the leak may have traveled through multiple people. Joe has found the channel. Not the source. And that means the hunt continues. Now we reach the most uncomfortable part of this theory. The infiltrator may be someone Joe has trusted. Not necessarily someone she loves. But someone she has relied upon. Because betrayal only works when trust exists first.